And I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker, Emily Goff. Emily Goff advances conservative solutions of transportation and infrastructure challenges as a policy analyst in the Thomas A. Rowe Institute for Economic Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Goff proposes ways to reduce and reorient the federal role in transportation policy in favor of increased state and local control over their transportation priorities. Previously at Heritage, she was an analyst for Heritage's Federal Budget and Pictures, which even I could maybe even understand that. Her work and commentary have been cited by USA Today, NPR, Bloomberg, and any other publications that actually count. Mrs. Goff holds bachelor's degrees in political science and Spanish from the University of Georgia and currently resides in the beautiful city of Washington, D.C. So, Emily Goff.
Thanks. I think Dickens... Okay, perfect. I think Dickens called it the city of magnificent intentions, which is appropriate for the discussion today. It's good to be here. Thanks to you, Randall, for inviting me. Most of you do have the fortune of living outside of the Beltway, hopefully. So what I'm going to do today is give you a little bit of an update on what the folks in D.C. have been doing, what Congress has been doing with the highway bill, recap what happened with MAP 21, and also kind of provide a few predictions for next year, and of course my own recommendations about what Congress should be focusing on. What we wound up with right before the August recess was yet another extension of the highway bill till May 2015, yet another bailout of the Highway Trust Fund, funded through the general fund, to the tune of $11 billion, and of course no Highway Trust Fund spending reforms because we did a status quo bill. How did we get here? Again, we've been here before. Before MAP 21, there were a number of extensions. We were trying to count earlier before the panel started how many we had. It'll be anyone's guess how many we have going forward. I would say that the funding question drove the conversation this go around. There was little to no effort to focus the conversation on the spending side of the equation, simply on the revenue side of the equation. Everyone was fixated on how do I fill this $15 billion gap between spending and revenue in the trust fund. And then if you kind of look at what the options were that were presented from January up until when we actually reached the final agreement, suffice it to say that most of the options were pretty poor from a fiscal responsibility perspective, from a good government perspective. I'll go through a couple of those. First, you had the President's Grow America Act. Bear with me as I take a deep breath and read what that acronym stands for. It's the Generating Renewal Opportunity and Work with Accelerated Mobility, Efficiency, and Rebuilding of Infrastructure Communities Throughout America Act. The Grow America Act. I had so much fun writing the blog post about that acronym. Hidden in that long acronym, you had more spending, no way to pay for it, no credible way to pay for it, and then of course a doubling down on a Washington-centric approach to transportation. There was a proposal to do corporate tax reform, which everyone knows was elusive this year, and then the president said it would be a temporary tax grab, which we all know how temporary tax grabs are in Washington. Moving on, you had Chairman Boxer from the Senate EPW Committee, Environmental and Public Works. She introduced a multi-year bill, the traditional one we're familiar with. It was largely status quo. There was no way to pay for it because that's the Senate Finance Committee's job. But at current levels of spending plus inflation, a 6-year bill left a $90 billion gap between spending and revenue. That's no small chunk of change. She had a couple other little things to throw in there, like a new competitive grant program, as if we needed one more of those, and just largely the same in terms of any kind of programmatic policy changes, environmental review, streamlining, and the like. Then as we got closer to this just drop dead date, and so keep in mind all along here, we've had the media and Congress and whoever else has a stake in having more money being spent from Washington was hyping up the construction jobs that would be lost, this construction shutdown. So there were claims that 700,000 jobs would be lost. My labor economist colleague looked it up, and there's only 300,000 direct jobs in construction of highways. There aren't 700,000 to be lost. The reason that the administration put forward that figure is because it used the same multiplier effects to compute that figure as it did for the stimulus projections. The difference was for the stimulus, they said we're going to have all this economic growth using the same flawed multiplier effects. And then, of course, they communicated this idea that construction workers would literally take their shovels and plunge them into the ground and walk away, and we would have a construction shutdown. Very similar media hype to the debt limit debate that you're probably all familiar with. I would point out, though, that even among this time, one of the things that I tried to focus on were some of the states that had taken steps ahead of time to prepare themselves for this and were actually in a relatively good position. Pennsylvania and Utah are two of those. And of course, they told Washington that they still wanted a multi-year bill. They wanted a solution from Washington. But they also said that, yeah, we're actually in an okay position. We'll be able to weather this storm if the Highway Trust Fund balance dips below a prudent level and the DOT has to send out payments to us as they have cash available. So then we get to the final push. It's literally just a jockeying back and forth between the House and the Senate. Chairman Camp of the Ways and Means Committee introduced his extension, which brings the current law through next May 2015. And it was paid for with the worst of all gimmicks that was universally seen as a gimmick. Even the Washington Post editorial board opined on how gimmicky it was and how dangerous it was. So the main pay for in Chairman Camp's bill, which is the one that was passed ultimately, uses a gimmick called pension smoothing. So it's basically just using time and money to our advantage to pay for spending now. What it does is the pension smoothing requires or it lets companies contribute less to their defined benefit pensions for funds for their employees. So that means more money to Treasury now because it's not going into those funds. So that's more tax revenue available to pay for this bill. Fast forward down the line, well, those companies have to make up for that, for the money that they didn't put into those funds. So that's less revenue for the Treasury. So we're just delaying the problem, and we're actually, frankly, creating a huge taxpayer liability potentially, where taxpayers would be called upon to bail out I'm going to try to get it right, Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation. So we'll see how that unfolds, but we don't need to go down that path anymore. I thought we had smoothed pensions so flat that they were concave, but apparently there was room to do that again. And then there's also a couple other things, the familiar Lust Fund transfer, leaking underground storage tank. I loved writing about that too. And then custom fees, some provisions there. Senate Finance got into the mix. Senator Wyden and Senator Hatch introduced their pay for. Their proposal would would have taken the extension to next May as well, which when I was writing, I said was more prudent than a lame duck one. They use largely similar pay-fors as the Camp proposal: customs fees, pension smoothing, the Lust Fund. But I think they dragged their feet a little bit, and Chairman Camp beat them to the punch and got into the mix earlier on. Then I'll point out an awful amendment that ended up being introduced to the final bill, thankfully failed ultimately. The Carper-Corker-Boxer Amendment. This would have extended current law squarely in the middle of the lame duck. And the only reason why that would be done, I would posit, is to increase taxes, to hike the gas tax, or to do something on the revenue side where they could have the political possibility of making that happen during the lame duck, which you can't do, under the regular order after the election or even before. And they did this, of course, under the guise of needing to solve this problem now, so trying to come across as being fiscally responsible and prudent and helping the states. But the real kicker, the real motivation was to hike the gas tax and impose that. And then finally, you had the Lee Amendment. Senator Mike Lee from Utah has introduced the Transportation Empowerment Act, TEA. In the Senate, that's Bill 1702. In the House, its companion is H.R. 3486. This is, you're probably familiar with devolution turnback. This is the latest iteration of that bill. The Lee amendment ultimately failed, but getting a vote on it was a huge win for my colleagues at Heritage Action, which is our lobbying sister organization, and also for me on the policy front, because we actually got a vote in the liberal-dominated Senate as opposed to the conservative-run House. And I will point out that this bill has now in the House 54 co-sponsors. That's more than it's ever had. That includes 4 Transportation and Infrastructure Committee members, which, if you know how tight a ship Chairman Schuster runs there, that's a big deal. That these members have felt comfortable enough, or at least been prodded enough, to break ranks and to put their name on this. Paul Ryan included it in his House budget, and of course the RSC, the Republican Study Committee, also included it in their budget. So looking forward to 2015, this next fight, there's some rumors that we could see action in the lame duck. Congress would need a revenue vehicle to attach the highway bill to it to try to do a longer bill. But I frankly don't see that happening because there's simply not enough legislative days on the calendar. And after an election, most members of Congress are concerned about what office space they're going to be in and what committees they're going to be on. So that will be consuming a lot of their time then. We'll still keep an eye on it, though. You never want to rule it out. I'd also point out that it's very likely that this current bailout won't last until next May. We thought, or the original plan with MAP 21 was that the Highway Trust Fund bailout would carry us through the end of this fiscal year, so the end of September. Well, we've already enacted a new extension to the tune of $11 billion, as I said, because we didn't have enough bailout money. It fell short by, I think the projections were it was going to run short. The trust fund would run short sometime in August when Congress was out. So I would expect sometime next spring, probably before May, that we'll be having to do this again. As I alluded to earlier, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a few more extensions. I really don't have a pulse yet on what the appetite is to do a long-term bill. I think there is an appetite for it among some leadership, but there's no consensus on how to pay for it. There really isn't in the House or in the Senate. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see more extensions, especially next May is the start of the construction season. The push will be to just get us through the construction season and not disrupt things. That also means that we'll hear the same sort of construction shutdown and 700,000 jobs arguments next year. So I think we are well armed and we can fight back against that and help to correct the narrative. I think there'll also be a likelihood of proposing to fix the gas tax, which would mean adjusting it to inflation, likely increasing it to make up for lost time, and then adjusting it to inflation or fixing it to inflation going forward. Perhaps coupled with provisions to pave the way for a VMT, a more expanded pilot program, tolling or a sales tax. I think we'll continue to see the same sets of ideas that have percolated to the top now. We'll see them again. I also think we'll expect to see more talk of a national infrastructure bank, which is, I could go into a whole presentation on how awful that idea is, duplicating existing federal programs that we have and just centralizing decision-making in Washington. So we'll be armed and ready to fight back against that. But I'll kind of wrap up here and say that I think we have a lot of opportunity. When the conversation in D.C. is about funding, which it always will be, we have an opportunity to dive into that conversation and to ask, well, what are we funding currently? Are we, and my co-panelists are going to get into this conversation in more depth, but we have the opportunity to critique what we are currently funding. So we're making it a conversation about spending. We're not saying that we necessarily need to dramatically reduce spending on infrastructure. I think that's what we're often characterized as being for, which isn't the case. But we need to be asking the question, well, are we spending money on the most cost-effective projects that are reducing traffic congestion for the people who are paying the gas tax in the first place? Things of that nature. So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to be writing about, what I'll be pushing for, we have a number of months, which is actually refreshing. I don't have to spend Christmas here, and we can do this next year. We're going to be continuing to push in the near term to limit spending to available revenues as a way to force efficiencies in the program, to force Congress to do what it should be doing in the rest of the budget, which is to set priorities, to set spending priorities. We're also going to be continuing to point out the tremendous efforts happening at the state and local level to generate revenue. You might be familiar with Ken Orski and his work. He has a wonderful laundry list that he sends out in a weekly or couple times a month newsletter where he lists all the states, the 28 states that have launched revenue initiatives to gain more fiscal independence from Washington and not be so dependent on the Highway Trust Fund. So Ken writes about how states have raised local fuel taxes, they've done wholesale taxes on gas, they've done sales taxes, tolls, revenue bonds, you name it. They're really experimenting quite dramatically at the state level and generating billions of dollars, which is giving them that increased fiscal independence. So when we get to a situation where the Highway Trust Fund is dwindling, they don't have to hit the panic button and sound the alarm as loudly as they otherwise would. So you have the funding, you also have financing innovation happening at the state level, whether that's using TIFIA loans, private activity bonds, toll revenue bonds, any variety of credit instruments used to finance capital-intensive infrastructure projects. The states are pursuing these, and as last night's discussion obviously showed, we can go into these individual examples and certainly identify bad ones and good ones. But I think the overall point that I want to communicate is that that is occurring at the state level. They're not sitting idly by and waiting for Washington to solve it for them. They're stepping up to the plate and saying, well, we have infrastructure needs, and we're going to figure out how to pay for them. So I'm so encouraged to see that happening at the state level, and I think we'll continue to see that, and it will only help our arguments to decentralize some of these transportation spending and funding decisions in favor of more state and local control and responsibility. So I'll leave you with an optimistic thought. I believe that federalism is alive and well, and that even though we might be dismissed as being outdated when we in our thinking, when we critique how we're spending money in Washington, God forbid we actually question what we're spending money on here instead of just throwing more money at the problem. So even though we're critiqued for being outdated, I think that tells us we're actually getting under, we're getting at the issue. We're actually saying things that are hitting on some of those kind of sensitive points that we need to be continuing to do. So as I said earlier, keep the conversation about spending, levy that criticism on what we're currently funding, highlight what the states are doing, the innovation happening there, and keep demanding fiscal responsibility from Washington with regard to the trust fund. So no more bailouts, no more using 10 years of revenue to pay for 10 months of spending. Conservatives hate doing that when it comes to other areas of the budget. It's curious to me why we're okay doing it with transportation, other than it's been recent practice. So I think we need to call that out for what it is, and more importantly, I think we need to continue to communicate to Congress, to special interest groups, to Americans really, the deficiencies in the current system and why moving to a new paradigm where states and localities could have a bigger seat at the table and more of a say of their transportation dollars, how that could translate to increased mobility and less traffic congestion for them, as opposed to the way that the current system has failed to do that. I'll leave it at that.